Welcome back, everyone, to the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. I'm your host, Wedge. Today's episode will be the 10-minute report Steelers. Before we jump into today's episode, please make sure you press that follow button and rate the podcast right here on Spotify, as well as check out my many other episodes. After the Steelers, there's 2 more teams, and then there will be a 10-minute report for every single NFL team up on the Wedge 52 Gridiron Podcast. If you guys are unfamiliar with the 10-minute report series, that is where I take 20 minutes of study plus my already established knowledge to create a 10-minute podcast. With that being said, let's jump into today's episode, the 10-minute report on the Pittsburgh Steelers. Starting off with quarterback Kenny Pickett, who is now entering his second season in the league. Last year, he had 2,400 passing yards, 7 passing touchdowns, 9 interceptions on 63% completion percentage, as well as 237 yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. Kenny Pickett is certainly picking up a little bit of buzz from fans, Steelers fans, people around the league, because of his. They're looking for a second-year jump, similar to kind of what Trevor Lawrence had. Is a lot of people are hopeful for that. With his numbers, I definitely think he has quite a bit of work to do to be able to dictate if he's going to be the next guy for the Steelers. Some of his weapons include George Pickens, who was also a rookie last year, showed quite a few flashes, made some spectacular catches on the sidelines, diving sidelines catches, one-handed catches. So Pickens, definitely showed some flashes of being a true number 1 receiver, and I expect him to have a little bit of an increase in production, where last year he had 801 yards and 4 touchdowns. I would not be surprised if he goes over 1,000 yards and has a couple more touchdowns this season. They also have Deontay Johnson, who last year had 882 receiving yards, but no touchdowns for the first time in his career. The previous 3 years before that, he had 8 touchdowns, 7 touchdowns, and 5 touchdowns. Steelers are definitely looking to open up their offense more again and hopefully get Deontay Johnson in the end zone. This offseason, they also traded with the Rams. They swapped 7th-round picks, as well as the Steelers received wide receiver Allen Robinson, who last year as a Ram had 339 yards and 3 touchdowns. Coming out of the backfield, they have Najee Harris, who's been very solid in the couple years that he's been a Steeler, since he's been in the league. Last year, Najee had 1,034 yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground, as well as 229 yards and 3 touchdowns receiving. So Najee Harris is definitely a very solid running back for them. They are hoping, and I expect, continued similar production from Najee Harris. And then at the tight end spot, they have Pat Freiermuth, who had 732 yards and 2 touchdowns last season. Was a drop in touchdowns for Freiermuth, but his yards were consistent to his previous seasons. Their offensive line is probably middle of the pack. They do have a couple of new additions to help maintain that offensive line, and they're hoping that their first-round selection, Broderick Jones, out of University of Georgia, starting left tackle, he will start for the Steelers right away. They are expecting him to turn into a cornerstone beast of an offensive lineman, who in 28 games at Georgia only allowed 2 sacks. Definitely a good selection by the Steelers. And then they also went ahead and signed left guard Isaac Seumalo, who last year was a Philadelphia Eagle. They signed him to a 3-year, $24 million deal. And last year, he only allowed 1 sack and had 9 penalties. So he is a left guard. So expect a strong left side for that Steelers offensive line for the 2023 season. moving over to the defense, and potentially what's going to be their biggest weakness this season is going to be their cornerbacks. They lost Sutton this offseason. He went to Detroit. And then, but they did sign Patrick Peterson, who's definitely the most noteworthy cornerback, probably cornerback number 1 on their roster, which Patrick Peterson actually had himself a very solid year last year in Minnesota with 66 tackles, 5 interceptions, and 15 passes defense. So it was kind of a little bit of a resurgence for Patrick Peterson after the couple seasons prior to that, where he did not perform quite that well as he did last year. But having him as your cornerback number 1, with him being 33 years old, and obviously, kind of had a slump for a couple years. So it'll be interesting. And they did draft Joey Porter Jr. Out of Penn State, 32nd overall this draft in April. He had 27 tackles and 11 passes defense last year at Penn State. Porter is very good in man coverage, in my opinion, but he surprisingly gets a decent amount of passes defense for sure. But I believe he only had 1 or 2 interceptions throughout his 4 years in Penn State. So I do expect a little bit of a learning curve for Porter, or, just at least some time for him to get acclimated and hopefully, be able to perform well and turn in and take over that cornerback 1 position, cornerback 1 role for the Steelers in the next couple of years to come. Moving down to the box for the Steelers, this is where their front 7 is very good, especially their defensive line and that edge position. Last year they have TJ Watt, who last year dealt with a torn pectoral muscle, missed some games, but then came back and was solid, especially for his health status. But they're excited, I'm sure, for him to be fully healthy again this season. But in just 10 games last year, he had 39 tackles, 5.5 sacks, 8 tackles for a loss, and 2 interceptions, all in just 10 games, dealing with that injury as well. 2 years prior to that, TJ Watt led the league in sacks each season. I think he had 22.5 sacks in 2021 and 16.5 in 2020, if I'm remembering correctly. And he's also a 3-time first-team All-Pro at that edge defensive end position. So he's back healthy. He will definitely be a force to be reckoned with. And then on the interior D-line, they have Cameron Hayward, who last year had 74 tackles, 10.5 sacks, and 14 tackles for a loss. And then on the other edge spot, they have Alex Highsmith, who just earned himself a 5-year, $68 million contract extension with the Pittsburgh Steelers after having his best year of his season last year, where he had 63 tackles, 14.5 sacks, and 12 tackles for a loss. So definitely a good year for Highsmith, and got him awarded a nice contract extension. Moving back to the linebacker position, they signed a trio of what I would say probably mid to slightly above tier linebackers. First one being Cole Holcomb, who last year was in Washington, had 69 tackles in 7 games. And then they also signed Miami linebacker Elandon Roberts, who last year, he's definitely the best of the trio that they signed this offseason. Roberts last year had 107 tackles, 4.5 sacks, and 10 tackles for a loss. And then just recently, they signed linebacker Quan Alexander, who last year for the Jets had 69 tackles and 6 tackles for a loss. But Quan Alexander has had a very solid career up to this point in his career. He's been in the league for quite some time now, probably 8 or 9 years, and has always been a solid borderline linebacker 1, linebacker 2 kind of guy. And then, of course, on the back end of all that, they have the elite safety, Minkah Fitzpatrick, who last year had himself another solid year, coming really to no surprise. He had 96 tackles, 6 interceptions, 1 return for a touchdown, and 11 passes defensed. Those 6 interceptions last year were good enough to make him the league leader in interceptions. So that wraps up our 10 minutes on the Pittsburgh Steelers, which leaves me with just one thing remaining. And that is my 2023 record prediction for the Pittsburgh Steelers, where I predict they will go 7-10. That's all I have for this 10-minute report, Steelers. Thank you all for listening if you made it this far. Please check out my other episodes as well as follow me here on Spotify and Instagram at Wedge52Gridiron. Thank you, and go Ravens.